We're starting Be'ez Hashem Siman Zion in haGuela v'Al Tamura. So he's talking about the nisim that allegedly happened in the war, and he's proving from different sources that it's not a nace when the weaker side wins a war. So even if the Zionists had been weaker or had been less numerous, it would not be a nace. V'kasev Ramban Zal, b'parshas Ekev al apasik v'amarta bilvavecha koichi v'oitzim yadi asa liyas achayil hazeh. This is this week's parsha, and this is a favorite pasuk of mashkichim and people who give drashas to illustrate the fallacy of thinking that your power made your success, and it's not from Hashem. Every Yid has to remember everything he has comes from Hashem, and he should never say these words. Koichi v'yotzim yadi asa liyas achayil hazeh. So it says in the pasuk right afterwards, "V'zochartu es Hashem Elokecha, ki hu anoisim lecha koich la'asos chayil." Remember Hashem because He's the one who gives you the strength. So the Ramban says, "V'lichoira eich yitzuyer lachshoiv koichi v'yotzim yadi asa liyas achayil hazeh es kol achayil hazeh." The Ramban goes on the Havamina. He says, how could it be that a Yid would even think, in the case of the war against Eretz Canaan, how could anyone think that it was their own strength? Bishlam, in our everyday life, someone could think that, but in Eretz Canaan, it says, "Acharei she'akasuv tzavach v'oimer goyim gedolim v'atum mimeka mikem." The goyim of Canaan are more powerful than you. V'rabi magoyim ho'ela mimeni. It says, "Kisto emar bilvavcha rabi magoyim ho'ela mimeni echa ucha lohayrisham." Right. So how could it be that simultaneously the Jews are saying these people are more powerful than me, and then when they win the war, they're turning around and saying, you know what, it was our own powerfulness that won the war? How could you do that? Which, by the way, is exactly what happened by the 6-Day War. The Zionists openly spoke before the war. They said, yeah, they're more powerful than us, they're going to win, we have no chance, David and Goliath, right? And then, after they won, they said, the secular Zionists did. The Frum Zionists said, Nisim. So, the question is...
Well, I guess I can't blame them both.
Right, so the question is who's right, and also the question is what's going on here? How could it be that the Havamina, how could they say Koichi v'yotzim yadi, and how could they, if they originally said they're greater than me, how could they say that? So, and the Ramban points out, v'hitzrich hakasuv lahazir v'loymar lo yisira mehem. The Torah had to be for when it said Kisto Mar Bilvavcha, when a Yid would say, maybe these people are too great for me, I can't conquer them, the Torah had to tell them, Lo Yisira Mehem, don't worry, Hashem's going to help you just like He helped you in Mitzrayim. V'eich yoymar ha'adam koichi v'yotzim yadi. V'hizbir Ramban HaKadosh. The Ramban explains, Yadua ki Yisrael giborim ve'anshei chayil milchama. He says, no, the Yidden were powerful. The Yidden were very, very strong, and they were heroic warriors. Ki nimshulu arayas u'zev yitraf. They were compared to lions. He says Yehuda, Gur Aryeh Yehuda, Binyamin Zev Yitraf. U'malchei Knan b'milchama natzchu eisam Yisrael. That it turned out that in the war of Canaan, the Yidden won. Al kein Omer Akasuv im tachshav koichi v'yotzim yadi asa liyas achayil hazeh. If you think it was your own strength that made you win, tizkor Hashem shehoitzi oischa me'eretz Mitzrayim. Remember the Exodus. Remember that at a time when you didn't have any strength, you were just slaves, Hashem saved you. The place that you had no way of living naturally, Hashem gave you the man, He gave you the bear, and He gave you the ability to live. Therefore, even this war that you won with your own koyach, it's not really your own koyach, it's really Hashem that made you win. Also remember that they were powerful, and they were something that you used to say, how could you stand up to them? Then you'll know that Hashem is the one who is passing over in front of you, and Hu Yashmidim, Hu Yachnim, He's the one who's beating the enemies, not you. V'loi koichacha v'oitzim yadecha. Avol yad Hashem os zazois. It's the hand of Hashem. Ayin sham l'shoynei hakadosh sheherich bozeh. Mevur medivrei Ramban zal da'afil b'milchemes lamed aleph malachim. So what does the Rebbe take out of this Ramban? That the taina of koichi v'oitzim yadi is actually a reasonable taina to a certain extent. Even in the war against the Canaanim, sheheida Torah k'dosha shayu atzumim v'rabim ma'oid. The Torah does say that they were greater than the Jews. V'afal pichein hayam mitzias litois. There was still a possibility to make this mistake. V'loimar koichi v'yotzim yadi. V'av shehi tois gomer, even though it's a complete mistake in that case, and it's really wrong. Aval mikol makom ilu loy hayam mitzias lazeh b'derech hateva. If there were no way to make this mistake, litois v'loimar koichi v'yotzim yadi, loy hutzrach akasav listar divreim. The Torah wouldn't have had the right words to contradict this position. Ulaharich barayas, and to bring proof. Mitzis Mitzrayim, b'nisei Hamidbar, v'gam mima shahayu b'nei Anak. The fact that they were giants. Asher Amar Akasav mi yatsev lifnei b'nei Anak. So the Torah wouldn't have had to write all that if not for the fact that that it's possible to say. So this is another proof in his list of proofs that the weaker side or the smaller side could win a war naturally. And that's not considered a nace. So going back, he has a proof from Chanukah that they don't, the Pri Megadim says that Al Nisim doesn't apply to a war, the war of the Chashmonaim, and he has a proof from the Bnei Binyamin winning the war against the other Shvatim in the Peleg Shvagiva. And this is another proof to the same idea that the weaker side could naturally sometimes win a war. All these words that I've brought prove that winning a war is usually not a miracle. It's something that's natural, and it depends on your hatzlacha, your abilities, and other things that could be chance. Even if it sometimes happens that the weaker side wins, and the smaller side wins. The Pri Megadim says that by Chanukah, the Chashmonaim were the weaker side and they were the smaller side, and still, b'derech hateva, they could win. Now we come to the 6-day war. That kol shekain, it's true, the Zionists against the Arabs, there it didn't even look like a miracle. The other cases he brought, maybe Rabin Biyad Ma'atim, looks like a miracle. But here, that's not the case, because Ki Yodua, it's known, Shehoaravim Vayishmaelim Einam Anshe Chayil, that the Arabs aren't warriors. They're not powerful in war. V'niskayim bohem abracha shekibel aviyim Yishmael al Pnei Kol Echav Nafal. It says in the end of Parshas Chai Sarah, it says Yishmael, it says Al Pnei Kol Echav Nafal. He fell over all his brothers, which means that after Yitzchak died, Yishmael began to decline in power. V'ayin b'Rashi Sham. Yeah, Rashi says Kan hu oimer loshen nefila ulahalan hu oimer al Pnei Kol Echav Yishkoim. Earlier it said that the Yishmaelim live among their brothers. Here it says they fell. So what's the difference? Ad shaloi meis Avram Yishkoin. Mishemeis Avram Nafal. Not Yitzchak, I meant Avram. Until Avram died, they lived normally, but after Avram died, they began to fall. Meaning they fell in their power and their influence. So the Yishmaelim are not powerful. Yisrael hema giboyer milchama, but Jews are powerful. K'mavur b'divrei Ramban hanal. So when they get a state and they get an army, they fight. Umatzinu b'divrei Chazal sheYisrael b'teva azim heim. That Chazal even say that Jews are naturally bold and strong. K'de'isa b'Maseches Beitza daf chaf hei amud beis mipnei ma nitna Torah l'Yisrael mipnei shehein azin. Why was the Torah given to the Jewish people? Because they're bold, they're chutzpahdik. Pirish Rashi, v'nitna lahem Torah sheyasku ba. Therefore Hashem gave them Torah that they should study it. V'hi mateshes koicham. And once they learn Torah, their power will go away. They'll become weaker. Umachnas libam, it humbles their heart, makes them less audacious. V'tana devei Rabbi Shmuel, ilmale nitna Torah l'Yisrael, ein kol uma v'lashon yicholim la'amod bifneim. If the Torah wouldn't have been given to the Jews, they would have been so powerful that no other nation could stand up to them. Nimtza de'im ein lahem Torah. So you see now that the Zionists threw away the Torah. V'hema hepecha Torah, they go against it. Nisharim bi'azusam, then they get back their chutzpah and their strength. V'anu roim zois bechush. We see this with our own eyes. Shemachtzifim pneiim be'azus v'chutzpah l'daber kashas af neged meluchos atzumois. That the Zionists, they speak obnoxiously against powerful countries and leaders. They fight against other nations. They provoke other nations all the time. Hashem yirachim. Hashem should have mercy that this shouldn't lead to anything. So therefore, going back to the 67 war, there was no nace, he says. Ela hatzlacha melubash b'teva. It was hatzlacha which is clothed in nature, which means that naturally it's possible for them to win, and the right circumstances led to them winning. Ka'asher heidu harbe yoyde davar. Many people who know the subject of military theory were made that this is true. V'sari meluchos. Many government officials said this. B'michtevei awitim. It was printed in the newspapers. Shal umos ha'olam. Shehigidu meirosh. They said even before the war started. Shalo yinatzchu ha'aravim b'milchama. They said the Arabs aren't going to win the war. The lav b'nei milchama ninhu, because they're not good fighters. And this we saw already. There's many places you could bring to this, but I just have this because we had this printed out when we did the Hakdama. There's a book, 6 Days of War, Michael Oren.
Oh yeah, that's famous.
So
he's ambassador.
There's a paragraph
he was ambassador
that Eben came to America to get permission to start the war. So he met with Defense Secretary Robert McNamara and General Earl G. Wheeler. And Wheeler and McNamara explained how the IDF would win a war in 2 weeks, even if attacked on 3 fronts simultaneously. 1 week if Israel shot first. So they predicted it before. And he said in training, motivation, and communications, Israel was vastly superior to its foes, and therefore had nothing to fear. So therefore they discouraged them from attacking first. They said, you don't have to worry. But the point is that the Johnson administration advisors all said that the Israelis were going to win, and Johnson himself said it, and when the Satmar Rebbe himself said it, by the way. And it's interesting, if you look in the Hakdama, not the Hakdama, in the preface.
In your book or somewhere they said Israeli soldiers had pictures of them?
That's where it comes from. Look at the Psicha. I don't know if you have it in yours, but
they took it as a blessing.
Rabbi Yosel Ashkenazi writes that in page Daled, he says, "Oy b'haschalas yimei hamilchama hibiya Rabbeinu Zal datoi levoy beisoy shelafi avanasoy bar hadavar shatziyonim inatzku milchama." He says, even at the beginning of the war, the Rebbe already said that the Zionists are going to win. It's on page Daled in the Psicha. On the second line, it says, "Hagoynoi hazach ve'havanasei hamakifa shel Rabbeinu Zal af b'inyonei havayas ha'olam." That the Rebbe's understanding of worldly matters, hevia etzlei hamaskana lazu. He brought him to this conclusion: Ki lefi erech koiches hatzava shel Tzionim mitzad echad, mitzad hasheni chalishas tchunas nefesh mahus ha'ravim. That the power of the Zionist army and the poor morale of the Arabs, v'gam miyut yediyasim b'marachim milchama, their lack of experience at warfare, harei mistaber shebederech hateva hanitzachon yeh al tzad hatzionim. He said it was natural that the Zionists should win. So he goes on to say an interesting thing. He says the Rebbe was saying this to somebody and walking home from shul, and there was a Zionist newspaper editor following behind them, and he reported in the paper, and he put a big headline that said, "Ho'admor misatmar misnabe al nitzachon al-Medina." The Satmar Rebbe prophesies that the Medina is going to win, and everybody made a big deal out of it. And it says at the end of this paragraph, Rosh Yatzav v'chayalim sheboy ha-milchama im shavu mi-ha-milchama im tmunos mi-rabbeinu biyadam. They had pictures of the Rebbe in their pockets during the war. Im divrei shevach v'arat liyosei hayechidi shenisnabe al hanitzchoin ha'magadol. He said, look, the Rebbe was the only one who predicted that we would win the war. And then the Rebbe was very upset when he heard about this, and because he didn't say it as a nace. They took it the other way. Or
like a blessing?
Like a blessing, right. They didn't take it that way. They took it that way, but he didn't. He meant it as B'derech HaTeva, they're going to win.
The Lubavitch Rebbe didn't say it?
I don't know.
I thought that's why they believe he's a Mashiach.
Yeah, I don't know. Anyway, so, no, that's because they say he predicted the Gulf War. It's something else. He predicted that they would be saved from it. Anyway, so it says the whole week before the war he said this, and then during the war he was upset about it, and then the whole week after the war ended, or during the war actually, it says the Rebbe himself wasn't sure whether to publicize and say divrei Torah about this, but then after he heard, it says Ulam hashmua hamesulefes sheifitzu bishmoi sheki'ilu gam hu nasan yad lepoishim. They thought that he himself contributed to the Zionists' pride and gave them encouragement. Mishamayim nilchamu l'toivasim. He's saying min hashamayim, Hashem fought for them. He says the Azru l'nitzchonim zeh kanira hichriya etzloi hakaf. That's what pushed down the scales, and that's what shemutal Allah the hoitzi cherev mita'ara. That it was the Rebbe's obligation now to take out his sword and go to war against the Zionists. So that's why he ended up saying his Shalosh Shudas Torahs. Anyway, so yeah, basically, and the famous line the Satmar Rebbe said, if the 6-day war was a nest, then Johnson was a Navi.
Who said this?
The Rebbe. Yeah. Oh. So the point is, everybody already knew the Zionists were going to win. It wasn't Rabbim Biad Ma'atim or Chalashim or whatever. Now, by the way, the Zionists have been saying Nissim for years. So now there's an article by Gil Student online somewhere.
Gil who?
A student.
Oh,
that's his name. So he has an article about this, and he says, yeah, it became known that it wasn't a nace. You know, it used to be that the people who made Kiruv books, used to write about it, and
they still do it.
Yeah, they still do. But there's a famous line where somebody said something like that at West Point they don't teach the 6-day war because they don't teach Nissim.
Yeah, I heard that too.
So it's stupid because it's not true. They do teach it. They teach it like they teach all the Israeli wars. So this guy, Gil Student, he came up and said, okay, in the Hanami, it wasn't a nace. It's they do teach it at West Point, and but the nace was that the Arabs made so many mistakes. In other words, B'derech HaTeva, right? After the Arabs made the mistakes, it was natural that the Israelis should win. But why did the Arabs make so many mistakes? That goof was a nace. That's what the Rebbe means by Hatzlacha Melubash B'Teva. He's not disagreeing with that. He's saying it's Hatzlacha, and it could sometimes happen that a weaker side would win a war. Now, the Israelis weren't the weaker side anyway. But the fact that the war went so fast and that they won so decisively, that was based on the Arabs' mistakes and various things that happened that didn't have to happen. But in the end, they ended up happening. Yeah. And by the way, people also asked, when Rabbi Yaakov Shapiro came out with his book, people got angry and they said, what do you mean? There was a bomb that fell on the Mir Yeshiva and didn't explode, and people were saved, so how could you say it's not a nace? So he said, obviously, there were nissim. I'm not saying that there weren't any nissim. He's saying that the war wasn't a nace. But if a bomb falls and doesn't explode, yeah, in Chanami, that's a nace. That's a nace to protect the people that
who could
have been killed. Okay, weiter in haGuela. Udechirna kad havina be'eretz Yisrael oed lifnei akamas haMedina. That in the years that the Rebbe was in Eretz Yisrael, only 1 year actually, between 1945 and 46.
Techirna means to remember?
I remember, yeah.
How come he uses the Aramaic term?
It's because it's from the Gemara. It's an expression. It says, "Isparu az manhigei hatzionim." That at that time they were talking about making a state, and it wasn't so pashut that they would succeed, even if they got permission from the UN. But they were just a few people who were disorganized. They actually were pretty organized. They had the haGuela, but they didn't have enough weapons. And some people said it wouldn't work, right? He says, the leaders of the Zionists were boasting, they're not afraid of war with the Arabs, even though there's more Arabs than there were Zionists, because the nature of Arabs is to run away from the sword. Now, really, in the 48 war, the Arabs were just not prepared. I don't even know if you have to come on to this teva of the Arabs to run away from the sword. They weren't prepared. There was no trained army in the Middle East except the Jordanian Legion. And the Jordanians promised to stay out of the areas that were allocated by the UN to the Zionists. So really there was no serious threat to the Zionists in the territory allocated by the UN. Now, in the parts that they took, that they weren't supposed to take, there they ran into some battles. Latrun and whatever. They ran into battles. Yeah, well, that was a massacre. But I'm saying they ran into some battles with the Jordanian Legion, Gush Etzion, places like that, places where they weren't supposed to be. But places that the UN allocated to them, they didn't have any serious, credible threat. Ulam achshav oimrim hahepech. He says now they say the opposite. Now that even though the Zionists themselves say that the Arabs are nothing to worry about, but now they say the opposite. Kedei l'samoy so'inayim. They just say it in order to make people blind. Lahagdil nischoinam, in order to exaggerate their victory. V'niseihem hakois v'samadumos, and to exaggerate the alleged miracles. Ushchudei shachti l'bali michtevei oitim, and they pay off the newspaper writers lichtov kitzoinam to write whatever they tell them to write, kedei lahagdil nitzchoinam mugvrosam, to make it look like they were very powerful. Avo barer she'ein b'chol zeh afilu reach shel emes. Nothing of it is true. None of it has anything to it. V'kol zeh yadua v'loy hayat tzarich laharich b'chol zeh. Really, all this stuff is known to anybody who wants to know it. And I didn't have to bring all these proofs, ulaharbois barayas, to bring proofs that miracles could happen, that wars could happen without miracles. Kihem dvarim meduim. Aval herachnu bozev hutzrachnu lahatik divrei chazal. The reason I brought these chazals down is mipnei goydel sami yisreinayim hashoyer b'yameinu eila, because of the fact that people are so blinded today. V'yasamach mem miskaber uchol chaysav. Samach Mem is trying very hard. And he's coming in the form of these religious Zionists. They go to the other extreme, and they actually say that you are obligated to believe in the miracles of the war. Anybody who doesn't is like, it's like you're a kofer if you don't believe in miracles. And they say even further, they say that the nisim of the war were greater than the miracles of Yetzias Mitzrayim. And we'll see more about this in the next Siman, Mir Tashem.